Massive welcome to all of you 7,554, I think now, subscribers, our channel members, and of course, first-time viewers to what I hope is going to be an hour of insights and actionable advice from two leaders in their fields, Mr. Steve Hindle and Mr. Paul Dunlop. For those that don't know them, Steve is the founder of Achilles Shield, a global operational cybersecurity consulting and advisory organization that specializes in building operationally lean programs that protect your future. An operational leader, presenter, and change agent, Steve's a seasoned global executive with a reputation for delivering a solid foundation of trust, resilience, and of course, good humor to build best-in-class and business-forward technology in cybersecurity programs. Also well known for his strengths in leading organizations through complex change. He's delivered crisis response in globally disrupting events, including cyber attacks, breaches, civil unrest, and natural and man-made disasters. And Paul Dunlop is the COO of Fraud Doctor, a professional services firm based in Tampa, Florida, advising organizations in both public and private sectors in their management of fraud risk. He joined Fraud Doctor in 2018 with over 2 decades in-house industry experience in designing, then leading fraud and related risk management programs across global banking and insurance industries. He's also had a prior career in UK law enforcement, and earlier this year, Fraud Doctor launched their groundbreaking SOTA signal analytics with its industry-first ability to detect risks of accounting fraud and financial statement misstatements of companies from the outside in. Okay, bit of framing there. Today, we're going to unpack the recent announcement from the SEC of fraud charges against SolarWinds and their CISO and learn about the implications for both companies and executives moving forwards. But before we bring them on, and for those new to the channel, my name's Simon Lindstead. I'm the founder of the InfoSec Live community. And by sharing stories and best practices, we've had over 100,000 views here on YouTube. Thanks to all of you 7,554 subscribers the last few months. And don't forget, this all started with the global InfoSec Live community, which now stands at 5,543 members strong and growing fast, where we have study groups, mentor sessions, and regular networking events to help you raise your game in cybersecurity, no matter what stage you are in the career. And in fact, we've got a new leadership channel or leadership focus channel, which has just launched, encouraging collaboration and knowledge sharing. And finally, it would be awfully remiss of me not to mention our amazing community-driven in-person leadership events in both the UK and USA, with tour dates being released next week for 2024. Sponsor slots are now open. Links for this and the community site will be in the event description or on the YouTube channel. But if you're watching this live, please do like and subscribe. We want these to be as interactive as possible. So again, make sure you drop any questions in the chat and we're going to do our best to cover them all off at the end of the session. Okay, Simon's waffling intro over. Let's bring Steve and Paul on. Good morning, both.
Gentlemen.
Good morning, sir.
Great. Look, firstly, thank you for taking the time to come on. I hope I did an okay on both of your backgrounds there and didn't get anything wrong. I'd normally at this point ask you both to introduce yourselves, but seeing as we've only got 45 minutes to an hour, probably best if we crack right in.
I think you've introduced us perfectly fine.
Thank you, Steve. So I suppose the first question we should kick off with, but actually before I do that, Carlos Guerrero, thank you for becoming a new premium member. Big loves to you. The first question is, why are we here? Paul, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to drive this from, the accounting fraud and the SEC side for a second, Simon, because I think we all want to talk about the event, and we got to respect some of the players in that, and we're not here to obviously issue any judgment or opinions. For those of you who maybe don't play so much in the accounting fraud space, and I have now for a few years, research suggests that accounting fraud, probably about 40% of publicly traded companies at any one time might be manipulating their numbers. And that is a pretty provocative statement. But when you think about your own experiences and your own investments, maybe that's not so shocking. So have that in the back of your mind when you think about when we talk today about the SEC or other enforcement agencies and regulators, of why are they perhaps being more aggressive than perhaps you would have anticipated. Cybersecurity is important, and everybody on this line, I'm sure, is interested in cybersecurity, but you're a part of something much, much bigger. And that is in part what's playing out here today. In addition to that sort of scale of potential manipulation of numbers that investors rely on, unfortunately, the system, with the amount of money we spend, just like cybersecurity, has challenges in finding it. The whole system, whistleblowers, regulators, we only find about a third of it. 2/3 go undetected. And that's money that is not really being well managed in the market, and a risk that's not being understood. And even the third that we find normally takes about 2 years. And for any of you that follow the cases that blow up, invariably it needs a whistleblower to do it, and a whole lot of pain on those individuals' part to bring these things to light. So there is a much bigger picture here that the SEC is charged with dealing with. And no matter where your politics are, currently we're in a place where the SEC has said we're going to be much tougher than perhaps some previous SEC or other regulators. The second thing that I think is important, Simon, I think this does go to sort of the company involved and maybe the kind of clients they had, is this is not just an issue of, hey, somebody misled the market. This is an issue of there's some system shocks in here that have been going on. We have all heard the word supply chain. And when you go to business, your customers and how you play out in the market and where things go right and wrong, you've got to think about some of the big system shocks that regulators are worried about. So Wirecard was one, right? That wasn't a cyber issue, but it was a dishonesty issue, an accounting fraud issue, and it didn't just lock up the markets for investment. It locks up anybody who had to deal with payments. And so these domino type effects are really what's in the regulator's mind, as well as not just individual accounting issues, but the knock-ons, right? Does the system get a chance to deal with it well, or is it going to be surprised? And then more recently, Silicon Valley Bank here in the US, right? One company doesn't quite get it right, and look what happens to the whole banking industry. So there's a much bigger macro worry here that regulators are playing out. And cybersecurity risk is just one more risk in around accounting fraud. So I think those are really important to state. We'll dive into some more of the dynamics that people are familiar with or not as we go on. But I think that's, from my side, macro white way.
Thank you, Paul. Before I move over to you, Steve, I know that you've got a law enforcement background, Paul, and I spoke to a CISO earlier, actually, who also had a law enforcement background. And the way he framed it was, for it to have got to the point it has now, despite the bits that we read in the press, there'll be a lot more going on in the background that we don't know that could have influenced their decision to do that. Would you agree with that?
I'd agree with that 100%. And I think, we may touch on it more as we move through the session, but when, this at the end of the day, some of the headlines read, hey, charged and indictment and arrests and all the rest. And I think that comes from a lack of reading of what's going on. At the end of the day, this is a civil complaint currently. And if you read to the end of the 60-odd pages of the complaint, you'll see that the SEC is looking for certain things. The CISO to be removed from the industry and some level of monetary recompense for investors and likewise the market. But all SEC matters at the end of the day work forward with the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and other agencies like the FBI. That's just one prong. And whether that's one prong of maybe there's a parallel investigation or an enforcement to come, who knows? It's not uncommon. Whether it's an investigative tactic by the agencies to try and bring certain parties forward and maybe work and cooperate with others, who knows? That is what is happening in most major white-collar crime investigations, which at the end of the day, this is what it is. And we should not be naive that this will perhaps be the last action in this place.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I think the word naive, sorry, Steve, you go first. Yeah. I was going to say that the point naive, can I throw that over to you, Steve, on how do we get to this point? Because that sounded terrible, didn't it?
I love that. That's great. So speaking of naive, let's go over to Steve now.
Let me reframe that. Let me reframe that.
This is live TV, folks.
So the next question was going to be, how do we get to this point? And I was going to throw that to you. And around that, the word naivety does spring to mind because of people's understanding of the responsibilities of being on a board, corporate governance and all that. So Steve, unless you've got anything you want to add to why are we here?
No, I mean, I could not have summed up any of what Paul said better. This is where the industry is not very good at this. This is where cybersecurity professionals and executives aren't very good at this. There's a lot of pressure to be the smartest person in the room. There's a lot of pressure on executives to be subject matter experts. I mean, it's frankly flawed, right? Because we're only as good as what's in the public domain. And as leaders of leaders, we shouldn't be the experts and the smartest in the room. We should be relied upon for our experience, and experience is something quite different than expertise, right? You've lived it, you've breathed it. But if I need to, I've educated myself on large language models and generative AI because I came from not too long ago just machine learning and AI, period, right? So I've educated myself, but I'm not an expert in that. I bring other players to the table. And Paul and I you'll hear us talk in generalization, and you'll hear us talk about information that's in the public domain if you look hard enough. But over the course of the last 4 days, LinkedIn has blown up. I am in easily seven Slack channels, right? 2 Teams channels with different organizations that I work with. And everybody is talking and several people are posturing. And there's a lot of finger pointing. And I just want to lead in for Paul's piece about, why we're here and, where we're going to, where we get here. You're not going to hear that from us. And I think that's an important takeaway from for the audience as well. There isn't finger pointing here. This is just an analysis of the facts and our experience, having worked in big public companies, banking sector, private sector, government agencies, as we all have, right? I mean, that's the key piece here. And I'll just cap this off for how did we get to this point to say that we as an industry, we CISOs, CIOs, we are experts, or we have expertise in cybersecurity in general. We're relied upon to be the experts and have a team of experts behind us. But we're absolute novices when it comes to securities fraud. And so there's going to be a lot of, you're going to see, because of the way this is angled, you're going to see a lot of leaders out there in the field. You're going to see a lot of CISOs, a lot of people that deliver thought leadership and are active on social media. And you're going to hear them giving a perspective of a security leader. They're not going to be necessarily giving this perspective from, this is securities, this is securities fraud, this is what we're talking about here. And that, I'll pass this completely over to Paul to the how did we get to this point in why are the SEC, or why is the SEC now looking at CISOs?
Yeah. Steve, I think one just last point, Simon, I think bridges between these two areas of why are we here and how do we get here, right? Which is for those of us that have worked in other domains, and obviously mine is the investigations and corporate fraud and likewise now accounting fraud domains, you're not the first profession that's going through this cycle. And I think I want to pick on Steve's point of, if you do have the time to get your head up, and we'll talk about, how you as an individual might be thinking about this session. You're here for yourself, selfishly, hopefully, and you're here for your organization and your teams to learn how to start talking about this, right, and how to be better informed. This sort of event and the events that led up to it that are probably not so obvious to everybody here have happened in the space of AML compliance officers. They likewise have been out there doing the good thing for the nation, likewise doing the right thing for law enforcement, not quite getting it right, and all of a sudden they're in the crosshairs of they didn't get it right, maybe didn't make the right decisions, certainly weren't seen to be forthright, and found themselves maybe not a securities fraud action, but certainly some other kind of regulatory action that they are now the problem. We've seen it with fraud heads. I'll maybe touch on the Wells Fargo story in a minute. And there are also experiences where, like Wells Fargo, senior leaders in security, fraud, risk, or otherwise had to make very different calls of the organization was not listening. And they're still perhaps not listening. And those people, to Steve's point, looked around, took good advice and said, hey, I'm the only leader in this space right now. I have to lead me first. And I have decided that this is the right time to get off, or the right time to be public, or whatever it might be. And that doesn't come without consequences either. So I think I would say for those people that are feeling in a state of shock, as I think many people are expressing on LinkedIn, you're not the first profession to go through it. And I think there are some lessons to be learned, not only technically about what securities fraud, but reaching across to your peer colleagues in other risk stripes and saying, hey, how did this play out in your world 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think I think the most important part is for people to be educated around the area of fraud itself, perhaps, and the definition of that. Fraud's commonly defined as the wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. So how does that apply in what the SEC is presenting here?
I think it's a great place to start, right? It's an obvious word that we all bandy around every day, whether it's in social media about fake news, right? The word became very popular. If you search fraud, you'll get a certain character comes to the top of your search results. But it's like many things, right? When you use a word in everyday parlance, it has a basic understanding. But when you're in the profession, to Steve's point, you're supposed to understand what's behind it. We all talk about ibuprofen or certain over-the-counter drugs, but we don't know what's in them. We don't know what makes them up. When we talk about fraud, I think part of the learning here for the industry is you've got to know what's behind it. You've got to know where it begins and ends. And you've got to be accurate on that if you're going to lead other people. So you gave a certain, a summary or a sound clip of what it might be, Simon, and I'm not going to attempt to sort of teach everybody securities fraud legislation here. You didn't come here for that. But when you leave here, hopefully you'll have enough in your head that you can go to your lawyers and say, hey, I've heard a little bit about this. What else do I need to know, right? This is a bit of a just-in-time training. There's two sides to basic fraud, both here in the US and certainly in the UK, where I was familiar with it before. You've mentioned one, the one we see every day, right? Someone tells a lie and they tell a lie and somebody loses money and somebody gains. And if you ask 100 people in the street, they're going to sort of recount that sort of understanding of, hey, I got cheated, I got deceived, I got scammed, and somebody gained. But there's another understanding to it that is less spoken about and less understood. And I think it's important here as people think about securities fraud. And fraud actually is complete when somebody creates a deception or an artifice, if you want to use that technical word, and somebody's put at risk of loss. There does not need to be a personal gain in the criminal statutes or the civil torts for somebody to have been defrauded. And I think that's where many organizations kind of step off at the wrong place, and not just cybersecurity organizations, but likewise fraud leaders. They deal with a particular aspect of fraud, which is the one you started with, Sam, right? Somebody lies, somebody gains.
Yeah.
And as we look through this indictment, it might read like that. But I don't want anybody to think, hey, this is a conversation. If nobody gained, then there is no fraud. No, the fraud is complete when a lie is told and someone is put at risk of loss or losing their opportunity. And I'd love people to go away from here today and go, I'll start my understanding of fraud there. And now I'll go read up on fraud in different places with a different mindset, and I'll ask more questions.
That puts things in completely different context, Paul. I had no idea that there was that secondary definition. I call it a secondary definition of fraud, where there's no perhaps intent to take money away from people, but by your actions of being a liar, basically, or misleading, you are still committing fraud. That's super interesting.
Yeah. The teams that we used to run, one of my former team members and colleagues was tasked with preventing fraud in a large public company amongst our general population that was servicing sensitive data, handling payments, various other bits and pieces. And it wasn't the fraud that everybody thought, right? It wasn't necessarily stealing of credit card numbers or things like that, right? It wasn't a direct financial gain in that regard. They were manipulating metrics. Now, manipulating metrics, right, is deceitful, right? You're basically doing what you can to hit targets, right? And the key piece around that fraud was if you hit targets, then the company gets more business, right? And if you get more business, you grow, hire more people on, benefits everybody. Didn't think it was harming anyone, right? As you know, as far as that's the mindset of the people that are committing that level of fraud is concerned. But then when you realize it, you nail it all down, you knock it down to its brass tacks. Targets mean bonuses. Yeah. There is some element of gain somewhere in the system.
I mean, I'd just like to explain why I smirked when you said that, because I was thinking about every salesman out there's pipeline and wondering if they're all sitting there thinking, shit.
Right. And, you know, Paul's worked in law enforcement, and I haven't. Several members of my organization, my team, my consultants that I use, we're all trained in the same techniques of interview and interrogation, right? And it's working towards getting a conclusion, working towards getting a confession. And law enforcement, police, when you get somebody in a room, they're not a court. They don't have to say things that are true. They can make promises that to somebody that they're questioning to get them to tell the truth and confess to the crimes that they're having, they're held to a different standard. You can't do that in a courtroom. Say what you want on Twitter, right? But then you put somebody in a courtroom and it's impeachable. And I say what you want because people do, right? Yeah. And that's where I think we're slowly going to head and get into those pieces.
Yeah, we'll move on to the echo chambers later on in the discussion. I think, right? Carlos has just mentioned it, in fact, in the chat, that he'd spoken to a cyber executive who was aspiring to be a CISO, but felt that for him to be successful, he had to break out of the cyber echo chamber. And
you need to be business people, and you need to stop being technical. When you climb up the ladder, you get to a point, and this is where we're going to head in this conversation. You get to a point where you're not asked or challenged about your cybersecurity experience or expertise or your qualifications. You're not challenged on that. That's an expectation. We'll get into expectations, right? And to that degree, as soon as I got to senior director VP and was looking at the C-suite, nobody questioned whether I knew what I was doing about cybersecurity or security in general. They questioned whether I understood the business and whether I was able to read the room and make the right statements that weren't going to get us in trouble and that weren't going to get the business, effectively shot down or otherwise, reductions in revenue. So I think, to echo all of Paul's points on that piece, everybody has a different understanding of fraud, but in this context of what the SEC is charging here, it's about misleading statements, and that's really important.
Thank you, Steve. You've probably framed that quite well, especially your comment around reading the room. So we have a very diverse group of people watch this channel. We have people who break it in. We have CISOs. We have mid-level career people. And I know we also have some people who perhaps haven't had much exposure to the industry at all. So we're talking about SolarWinds and the Sunburst attack. But for people that might not really be aware or understand what that was, do you mind just giving an overview on that?
Oh, sure. All right. So if we talk tech for a minute, which I tend to avoid doing, if we become slightly more technical in our arena here, SolarWinds as a company, as a product, as a platform, it's an early warning system. And it is the connective tissue that monitors and ties together all of your infrastructure, your network infrastructure, so routers, firewalls, switches, all of those pieces monitored by, and in some cases administered by, the teams that use SolarWinds as a dashboard to say, we want to know when a piece of hardware is faulty and it's not necessarily doing its job. SolarWinds will tell us that. We want to know whether the net flow information, the traffic that's passing across these firewalls, everything else, we want to know that it is kosher, that everything's good. SolarWinds will inform us about that. So as such, SolarWinds, right, was plugged into and is still plugged into the connective tissue that makes companies tick, the backbone, right, the network infrastructure. And then from 2018 to 2020, the bad guys cottoned onto this, that most big companies, that's a really important definition, right? Most big companies are hitting SolarWinds as a vendor, and they're tapping it, so they're using it. It's part of their essential critical infrastructure. If we talk about critical infrastructure, so SolarWinds, without SolarWinds, we don't have eyes on the environment. What do the bad guys do? The bad guys want to operate in the dark. So what did they start attacking? SolarWinds. 2018 to 2020, they launched an attack called Sunburst. Sunburst was targeting certain particular version numbers and levels of the SolarWinds product. And as such, all of that became a target. And I really want to stress this. We're talking big business being attacked, and we're talking big business doing the attacking. This was a nation state, sophisticated, Russian-led threat group, right? Not targeting any geographies. These are all facts, because those threat groups operate throughout the entire world. There are cybersecurity professionals working on all sides of the fence. The US has them, the UK has them, Russia has them, China has them, North Korea has them, right? And they're not bound by the rules of war. And this was a sustained attack against an organization in order to then get their customers. Their customers are big business and federal government. So that was the Sunburst attack, 2018 to 2020. I mean, that's a 2-year sustained driven attack against one company with the aims of then getting into other companies that use that product. So that's a little bit around Sunburst and SolarWinds and why that is really, really important to understand when it comes to the SEC's charges. So that's the SolarWinds Sunburst event, putting it in relatively simple terms, I hope.
Thank you. Sticking with the diversity of the community, the next point is around, well, let's say if there are CISOs or practitioners listening that don't work for public companies or might be outside the US, which we've got loads of people watching from outside, I'm sure. Does this apply to them as well, or is it just public companies? Paul, do you want to take this one?
I do, and I think it builds off your understanding of how the fraud world works, Simon, and how it differs. And again, some classic misunderstandings, right? You got to get behind the label. So when it comes to the US, and let's stay with the SEC for a second, but don't anyone draw hard boundaries of the SEC stops at the borders. Securities fraud, as somebody asked me in the week, well, this is new, right? Like, no, securities fraud is from the 1930s. This is not a new piece of legislation. This is not about cybersecurity disclosures. This is 90 years old. This is about, if you want to play in the public markets, you got to be transparent. And to Steve's point, the company involved here was in the public markets. It wanted capital from investors to be a successful business and grow. Somebody will say, well, okay, that's their public, right? Well, unfortunately, there's an understanding that the SEC only deals with public companies. It doesn't. It deals with private companies too. And certainly everybody should hear here that the anti-fraud provisions of the securities legislation applies to both public and private. And if you think about headlines that you see from time to time that maybe you don't click into and read, you'll see in recent time private companies sort of getting towards IPO who've been misleading the market about sales and even sometimes maybe their security stance. The SEC is looking at private companies too of, hey, you're not ready to come into the market. You're not transparent enough. You don't know how to deal with this. You don't have a risk officer. You don't have a CISO. You're not ready, right? You don't get to come and play in the big game. So, this understanding of fraud of public and private, and is it me or is it not, I think is a classic misunderstanding. So to summarize, if you're sitting out there and you're in the US and you're in a public company, you're in play. If you're in a private company, you're in play as far as the anti-fraud provisions are or apply. And if you're sitting outside the US and going, well, phew, that was close, maybe think for a second, right? If you are a public company outside the US and you trade as a company inside the US on a US market, you're in play. You're in play. And I'll go a couple of steps further than that. We're talking here about fraud, but at the end of the day, fraud's not a million miles away from bribery, and it's not a million miles away from corruption, and it's not a million miles away from money laundering. The US has made it very clear that when it comes to bribery and when it comes to money laundering, it has global reach. It doesn't care where you sit. If it touches a US citizen and a US dollar, they consider that their jurisdiction. So anybody on the planet who's sitting out there going, well, that's a localized problem there, and I can walk away from this and not worry. Maybe don't leave the show just yet, and maybe don't leave the story just yet, because I think it's coming to a town near you as well.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, next one is, why now? I think you mentioned that other industries have seen this before, and I'm sure future industries will see it happen again. But why is it happening now in cybersecurity?
I think I'd echo what I said at the top of the show, Simon. I think there's real worry in the markets that there is not enough transparency for investors. And I just want to add to that when we think about investors, right, don't think about big institutional investors, right, to the point of your moral compass. The people who get hurt in securities fraud are not the big players. They are the smaller pension funds. They're the pension funds of cops, teachers, nurses. They're the ones that can't absorb when a stock price dips because someone's not been transparent with the market or when the company gets found out. So those are the real losers. So when I hear people say, hey, securities fraud is a technical thing, right? There's no real hurt here. It's not really a big victim thing. Wrong. The people that get harmed are the folks that we all came into this kind of industry as peers to, and sometimes came from those industries, or we have them in our families. And I'd encourage everybody to get attached to where the real harm here is not technical rule breaking, as I think some people are trying to talk about it. It's about, no, this impacts real lives. that sometimes people retire and have to come back to work because their retirement's no good, right? Or
it's not a victimless crime, that's for sure.
Not at all. And I think sometimes organizations try to play that out. So I think that's one thing. I would add as well, Simon, that I've been a little surprised, I think, by some of the commentary and some of the reaction of, I'm shocked by this, as if everybody had only had their focus on the cybersecurity disclosure conversation for the last year. If you're outside of cybersecurity, and if you're outside of an in-house role like myself, you have the benefit of having a much broader view, and I know Steve wants to talk about this for CISOs more generally, you would have seen 2 or 3 things happening over the last couple of years that you know, if you've been in this game a while, and you've been another professional, like we said before, that's been through this cycle, you see the storms coming. So, you know, in 2014, you know, when the SEC goes and speaks at the New York Stock Exchange to boards about cybersecurity risk, that wasn't to go just for the dinner and the networking, right? It was to send that first tickle into the industry of, hey, you're real, this is serious.
Wake up.
Yeah, like you're the board, and we keep hearing that you guys don't know about this. So we keep seeing that maybe you're not sophisticated about this. So 2014, right? 2011 is when the SEC first put out very detailed guidance of this is what you should be disclosing for cybersecurity risk. The thing's about 5 pages long when you print it. And it's everything that's in this allegation right now of you didn't say these things or you didn't talk about this thing publicly, but you were happy to speak about it privately by all accounts, right? So the allegation goes. And then just a couple more nods on that, Simon. I think, you know, 2017, we start seeing, you know, the DOJ saying, hey, we're going to have a particular task force about cybersecurity risk for retail investors. And then 2021, the Department of Justice says, you know what, it's time we had a real focus on when contractors lie to the government loses, we should go sue them. And so when I see these sort of little steps and these little milestones, this is not a surprise at all. This is now just a natural continuation of individual accountability, where perhaps the government's been saying for 10 years or more now, hey guys, you haven't put yourself in order. We want more. And we haven't seen it in this particular instance, and therefore we're going to enforce.
And I think it's important to note, to reinforce some of this as we've been going through, the lens that's being turned on this and the opinions and perspectives of people looking at this from an outside in, because Paul's really looking at this from deep in the weeds, is everybody considers this and they hear the word charges and everything else, and they think about it in criminal terms. This isn't a criminal lawsuit. This isn't a suit that's being brought against, against an individual to charge them with a crime in that regard. It's a civil suit. It's not a criminal suit. It's a civil suit. And that I think is also, an important, I think, Paul and I both, we shared our opinions about this over a cup of tea, like two ex-British gents should, right?
Is it not that sometimes
we're going to get
civil
there,
suits are in line with a criminal investigation? Not alluding that could be happening here at all, but there is sometimes some.
I think Paul and I Paul definitely can speak more about this. One thing leads to another, as they say, right?
It does. Yeah, it does. I know we said we wouldn't take questions as we went through, but I do feel the need to bring this one up because it's relevant to what you guys have been talking about. Luke Keeley, thanks for tuning in, Luke. Given the necessity for transparency for investors, do you feel organizations need to change their own approach to security transparency by disclosing more about their posture and practices to their suppliers and customers through due diligence assessments?
And this is where I think Paul and I will slightly part ways and then come back together as good friends and hug it out.
Yes.
Because we
this is what we want.
We put this at the top, right? We talked about a broken compass, and we'll dig into this if we have enough time. We'll dig into this in much more detail. My opinion of broken compass, slightly different to Paul's, but we both end up at meeting at the same point. I am driven by, and many leaders and executives and CEOs have told me as I've worked for them that I have a very strong moral compass. What does that mean? It means I'm driven to do the right thing. We talk often, and we've all been at public events, and I have quoted, John Lydon, Sex Pistols, and said rules are for fools, Douglas Bader. And I have said a lot of things in that context because you shouldn't need rules to tell you to do the right thing. And I think, to answer that question, you can only be as transparent as your organization will let you. And you've got to remember, you're an executive of the company. You are there to secure the business and to grow the business. Many people lose sight of that. We're going to talk about that, as we get into promotion and being out there as a spokesperson. we are here today as spokespeople, right? But I think there's a level of transparency that you will always not be able to have. And nobody's really going to tell them about the depth of their security assessments. Paul?
Yeah, good point.
How far should we part, Steve?
Come on, go for it. This is why
I can
we're
move you
here.
around. Do you want me to move you down here so you're out of the way? There
We
go.
put this up as a panel.
hosting it.
Simon put this up in his title saying debate. Let's go.
We'll go
we
for
go.
it. Luke, we don't know each other, but thank you for putting, I think, an important question in the room. If you are an investor,
Turn this up to 11, Paul. Let's go.
Absolutely. I guess it depends on who the question lands on, right? And Steve answered it as a CISO. And, you know, my old boss had an expression of you sit where you stand and you stand where you sit, right? And so if you hear that question as an investor, how would you say anything but I want to know it all? And I think Steve makes very fair comment that they can't know it all. And they don't in the fraud world, and they don't in the compliance world, and so on and so forth. However, if you go to the investor community, whether public markets or private markets, and you want money, and you are taking other people's money, which I think sometimes companies forget, right? We get going, we're running a business, we're running on somebody else's cash. I think you've got to understand from them, have they asked the right questions? Have you allowed them to ask questions? And I think, Steve, this is important for this event as well, right? There are CISOs, like there are fraud heads that sit on the defensive side, right? They keep organizations safe. And there are professionals who use that capability inside a firm to go out and win business for the firm. There are certainly fraud heads that do it as well. And I think that's where maybe the risk starts to increase. You know, I think like a little radioactivity meter, right? How much is that radioactivity ticking and how much do you want to take on? And so I think most CISOs who are defensive in-house will not make many public statements. And I think we'll be able to stand exactly where you put a position, Steve, which is we have to keep the organization safe. We can only disclose so much. And I think the public and investors will get that. And afterwards, they may cry foul of, well, that wasn't enough. Okay, you pay your fine, you move on, right? Poor judgment. But I think this is a little bit different where there are companies that are out there saying, hey, I've perfected this. Well, that's an aspirational statement, right? Or I'm really good at this, or trust me, right? Let me in your shop and I can prove it with you. Those kind of statements. And I think when you're doing that in the public markets or even with private investors, you're sizing up that risk a little bit more. So I think, Luke, the answer to your question is, I think there needs to be more transparency, but let's not, again, be naive of we're going to, lift up the whole thing. But I would also add at the same time, which is investors are savvy, right? The market is about risk at the end of the day. If they think you can manage risk, if they think you can be the company that really is going to manage the challenges of having your network attacked or being able to secure users or being able to look after people's cash digitally, then they're going to put that money in that because they think you're good risk managers, to Steve's point. You're not good technical managers, you're good risk managers, and you can explain it well and objectively. So I think there is an argument to be said of it's not all, hey, we have to hide away here. If you go to the market with a level of transparency, at the end of the day is what you do in the public market, you should be rewarded by investors saying, hey, I'm going to come into your company and I'm going to put more collateral.
And that's the point where we hug it out and we meet back up exactly. So totally aligned.
And I think it's worth going back to what Steve was talking about. The fact that a lot of CISOs out there are now like a brand promoter, dare I say, marketer for the business as well. And this leads on a little bit, maybe tenuously, but slightly, Carlos, I'm trying to drag your point in from earlier here, to the echo chambers in the industry. Do you think, let's talk about that. Do you think that's going to change?
Yeah, it's actively changing right now. You went from being in-house CISO, right? So Paul has a really good perspective on this. And shockingly, it was really the first time I'd really dived into it when we were talking over a cup of tea. It's the outside in, inside out. I won't talk about that. I'll let Paul talk about it because actually it's really important you don't hear that from me. So I've been inside CISO or, growing up, right? Deputy CISO, 100% been there. And the role is you secure the business and you do what you're told. And then as soon as you step into the CISO shoes, it's a different lens. And to your point, exactly as summarized by Paul, you are a defensive CISO, you're securing the company, you are then understanding the risk, you're working it through and you're mitigating those risks and you're communicating risk. You have to learn to communicate risk as well. Then beyond that, if you move out of companies in that regard, there's a CISO that does both of these roles really well. Jamil Farshi, Equifax. Look at Jamil, look at what he does them both really well. He works, he protects, and then he's outward facing, 100%. Content, thought leadership, share things, make the industry better. You become a field CISO, which is a sales support role. It's a support engineer with a CISO title and CISO experience sometimes, right? And you're going out there and you are effectively pushing a brand. You're still pushing a brand, right? 100%. But now you're working more on the revenue generation side. You want to land that sale, right? Then you get other CISOs, fantastic CISO, Larry Whiteside. Let's talk about Larry, right? Also another Tampa native. We seem to have an enclave of security talent down here in the East Coast, right? East Coast, West Coast. So it's not a rap battle. But
oh, please, next one.
That would be funny. Larry will have me hands down. I mean, no contest. The pieces around that are, as a CISO, if you're working for a company and you are vocal and you are out there, you are very much seen to be delivering and driving thought leadership and attention towards your brand, even if you're not talking about your brand. So Larry, works for RedScale, and he's out there talking. He's not talking about RedScale. He's talking about everything. He's talking about the landscape, the industry, the risks, blah, blah, blah. He's talking about everything. But people will always associate with, Larry works for RedScale. Larry seems to know his stuff. Clearly, he's a representation of RedScale. RedScale must know their stuff. Yeah. I'm going to buy RedScale's product. And CISOs can be brand marketers. They can drive sales into the sales funnel. And if you are a no BS thought leader, I know it's a term that gets abused. I'm not abusing it here. I want to use it in its context, right? Delivering leading insight, right? That's thought leadership. That's what it really should be, not just influencing, right? If you're doing that, then you're going to push people towards the sales funnel and they'll be entering as slightly more qualified leads. Hey, I was at this conference, listened to your CISO speak. Seems pretty cool. Want to know more about your product, Mr. Sales Guy. Sales Guy's now, well, that's half of my cold calling.
That's on the pipeline, Paul, right?
Done, right? Okay. So you have to be a good brand ambassador when you're out there speaking, right? When I was a member of a public company, when I was going up those chains, not quite the CISO, I was still very active in the community. I would often be slightly censured by our legal counsel and my leadership. Hey, I want to go talk at this conference. I'm going to talk about that. Ooh, we'd rather you didn't, because our clients might hear that. And what exactly are you going to say? We need to see it first. Show us everything you're going to say. I'm like, I am a former stand-up comic, and I get on the stage and I don't have notes. There's not a lot of rehearsal here. There's no scripts. I'm talking from a point of experience. Yeah. I'm talking from a point of experiential view. Stand-up comedy is observational comedy. You say what you see and it becomes funny, right? And so now I'm doing the same with the lens on everything I've done in business, everything I've done in technology, security. There's a lot of people who read content off slides, and there's a lot of people who can't present without looking at the notes. And as you might notice, that's not me. I'm looking at your face right now, which is why I'm over here. My notes page is, I have a big monitor. My notes page is way over here, and it's mostly just to keep us all on time. So there's an avenue to that. But if you can't be transparent, if when you're out there on stage talking as a CISO or as a security person or a technology person, if you can't be transparent, right? If being truly transparent won't grow revenue and may impact your bottom line and may make people go, ooh, I'm not going to buy anything from that company, might be best to just not say anything at all.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So,
I mean, it leads on to what is the right thing to say or do, and is it going to mute and censor people in the industry, especially when everyone in this industry, really, no matter regardless, irrespective of what roles they're in, it's the importance of communicating risk, right? If that's going to take that away, what do you think is going to happen there?
And I think that comes into what Paul can shine a bit of insight and light on about outside in, inside out. pieces, because that really falls in.
Okay.
I think to pick up on some of the things you described there, Steve, I think I would absolutely say, and I'm not the first one to say it, I'm glad to see other CISOs have said it before, as the profession matures, and let's face it, the profession has not been around for that long.
We're babies in the board.
As you continue to find your way in somewhat uncharted water, and this is one more part of that uncharted water, it's going to need not CISO, it's going to need leaders. And that will sometimes mean taking off the CISO hat, as in permanently. I'm not going to be a CISO anymore because it needs leadership. I think it will drive, Simon, some realization of, if anybody wasn't aware of the markets that their company operates in, then that's the first perspective to change, right? I'm in a public company. I don't understand how public companies work. That's just up in your game, right? Just broadening your perspective. No shame in that. We all have to go through that growth. I think second, I'd add to that I had a former boss who actually brought in a deputy chief security officer, and I thought that was a little bit, I guess, like I questioned it of like, why do we need two of you? And it was a very deliberate move of the chief security officer is going to be outside. They're going to be talking to industry. They're going to be talking to OSAC. I think about it as ISAC. They're going to be talking to regulators. They're going to be talking to government agencies. We're a global company. They're going to be out there all the time. And they're going to be speaking to not only customers, corporates, they're going to be speaking to individuals. And they're going to be getting a really good pulse of what do people think out there. And I remember a moment in the financial crisis, you just remind me, Sam, with your hat. I want to get a haircut.
That's why I've got
the lady says,
a hat on.
Yeah. And she says to me, hey, you work for a bank, right? And she says that every time. And then she said, which bank is it? And I said, what? And, she's looking at me with a razor and a buzzer, right? And I'm thinking...
Don't say Lloyd's.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You're at that place of, well, hang on a minute. This is what people really think about us out here. To the earlier question, it was the first thinking of a big leader of how do I get outside my own echo chamber where people won't tell me my own company the reality. And I think, that is potentially what's in a lot of these issues is leaders have a perspective that on the outside in could look ridiculous. And I'm sure it could in this particular case. But at the end of the day, they rely on people telling them things. And sometimes people don't like to tell their own leaders bad news. So this is not just people. I don't like to think about some things as bad apples. I like to think of bad information, bad choices, and bad decisions made by good people. And rationalizing then, while it was okay at the time, well, maybe it wasn't. So I think, that inside out deputy served the role that I think worked really well for that industry and that risk domain of running ops, translating in the outside of regulatory expectations, to Steve's point, being able to have someone go outside and talk about leadership in the industry, frankly, to be able to set leadership standards for the industry, right? We as leaders in this space, we're going to sign a code of conduct of how we play. We're not going to let it be driven by individual codes of conduct. We as security leaders are going to sort of sign this formal, informal charter that says we're going to play this way, because when one of us decides to go outside of that, the peer group's going to come in and go, hey, you're hurting the profession here. And I don't know if it exists, Simon. Maybe this is something, for a follow-up for the group. But I think that's always been something that in watershed moments like this, professional groups sit down and go, hey, we got lots of training. We got lots of certifications in how to do the job. But have we really sat down and said, what do we stand for as a group of CISOs? What does that mean? And, Steve, that might be, what, we're not going to be marketers anymore. We're going to come back from that piece, or we're going to market in a different way, or we will be. So there's a lot of chat about, hey, I want to be on the board. I want to talk.
We could have a MISO, couldn't we? We've got BISOs for business. Can you not have
Aren't
a
most
MISO?
CISOs all me? I mean, did I?
I was thinking more of the soup. Yeah.
Fair enough.
But I think that's for you guys something to take away of someone, where is that code of conduct for someone coming up in the industry that says, this is how I'm supposed to play. And maybe that is one of the, look in the mirror moments as you go back to your own groups, because I'm sure there's a lot of boys there looking, I wonder what my CISO is going to say about this. Where are they going to stand on this? Are they going to be outright in defense of the parties involved? And they'll take a read on that. Yeah. Are they going to be, hey, we've been, not really thinking about this the right way, and let's start a more adult conversation. And you asked the question, Simon, I do want to say this. In moments like this before, where indictments or complaints get made, and they kind of quote different bits of the evidence, right? it's never the full picture, right? That's why I think we all need to sit back and go, let's see the way that this plays out for all parties.
And most people are just regurgitating what's on page 1 of this statement and throwing a lot of
they're echo chambers. There's full of it.
And I think some as well, then, there will be some people in moments like this that go back into their organizations and have a knee-jerk reaction, right? They'll be fearful of someone in my organization has had a chat message or an email that sounds like standing on the terraces at a football field, right? Wouldn't say it in front of family, wouldn't say it in church, wouldn't say it in front of the neighbors. And oh my God, we can't have that stuff, because if we have that stuff, that'll embarrass us in front of a regulator, or worse still, get us prosecuted. In my opinion, that is the worst possible reaction. You have to let people speak. If you go out there now and say, hey, I don't want any of this kind of careless chatter, I don't want this reacting to what you think is going on without knowing it, that's dangerous. And in fact, that will probably get punished if that starts happening.
And then we get back into my punk rock and my, freedom of speech. Absolutely. May not agree with what you say. Paul and I don't always agree, but you know what? We can always meet at the end of it. We can always come back and say these are common ground where we absolutely.
And this is what a debate should be anyway.
Right.
It's not about having points to argue about. It's about listening to each other and respecting.
I think the message, that the takeaway out of all of that for CISOs in particular, moving off that topic of CISOs as marketers and all the rest of it. Stay away from overstatement. Stay away from making broad brush statements, right? Don't talk about your company's risk with forward-looking statements, right? If you can't talk about it, don't talk about it, right? If you can't talk about it transparently, factually, don't talk about it. By all means, comment on what you see around you. That's why we're all here, to make things better. Comment on what you see. Share information freely. Hey, you know what? We found these TTPs, we found these IOCs, tactics, techniques, procedures. We found all of the IOCs, indicators of compromise. Share them, have them, make the industry better. Absolutely do all that. Where'd you get them from? Not able to disclose that. However, I'm sharing this to make you guys better, right? But don't make overstatements. Don't make generalizations. And this is where we really get into what the nuts and bolts of all this and how we've got to this point. To Paul's piece right at the beginning, this isn't new. This has been around since like 1930, bubbling all the way up to now, right? For CISOs in particular, we're talking about 5, 6, 7 years of slow build to, let's start holding people accountable for the things that they may say that may make investors do certain things, invest or withdraw money or withdraw investment, right? Be careful about how you say those things. Look at it from the lens of the average mom and pop in the street, looking at their pension fund, Paul's perspective. Right. I mean, follow the money. We always talk about follow the money, right?
Well, let's move on to that next, because I was going to do an impression of you.
Please go ahead.
I've got something to sound like, but before I get to that,
dodgy accent sounding blokes on a call. I'll do an impression of his mother.
This is after being having governance oversight, compliance functions regulated by the FCA for a number of years here in the UK. I used to always complain about their principles-based approach to regulation, but listening to you guys now, I think the ethos behind having that principles-based approach is sound. Maybe it's not always terribly well implemented, not casting any aspersions there, FCA, on your good books, I think. But do you think we need some sort of principles-based approach for the industry?
I don't think you have a choice, Simon, if you're going to play in the public markets.
Yep.
Yeah.
You're right there. And listen, it's till 2019 for the OCC, Office of the Control of Currency in the US, to publish a cheat sheet, effectively, of the principles of how to build a fraud management program for a bank. Yeah. And people might be angry at, I'm running a fraud program and there's no 3-inch binder I can take off to run it. I have to piece from it.
Outcome based. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know what? That was in part the regulator, not an enforcer, giving organizations the chance to figure out how much risk they wanted to take and how much risk they can manage, because the organization and the market is best equipped to do that. Yes. The alternative is have a very prescriptive approach, and then business doesn't prosper because nobody takes risks, or they take risks and they hide them. So, I've lived the principles-based approach, and it's dangerous. To Steve's, title here, occupational hazard. If you didn't think you were living in an occupational hazard, you have been. You walked into one when you joined the industry. You did when you joined a public company. If you're in a private company that's trying to be bought, you're playing that game. It's just how much do you know you are living in? I do want to say as well, Steve,
and
that you talked about.
Thank you to Dwayne Gran, who is the CISO that mentioned, my goodness, our charges and potential threats of Jane. So I'm now an occupational hazard for CISOs, and I was like, Dwayne, I'm stealing that. That sums up the attitude and the fear among the industry so well, and that's why it's here on the title of this. Thanks, Dwayne, and I think it really does hit it, right?
You're sitting on one. I think, Steve, you talked about how the CISOs and their organizations need to talk and be careful about how they speak, but be cognizant of there are people out there that are going to talk about what your program looks like, whether you do or not. And it's not just the bad guys. Legitimately, there are parts of the markets that want to understand where a company is vulnerable. And, if you're not familiar, I tend to think about those as short sellers. They're going to bet against your company stock. And where do they get their information from? Everywhere.
Yeah.
Rumor, facts, former employees, and not disgruntled employees, right? There's everything doesn't have to be bad if it comes against you. It's how the risk in the market gets priced. And, we're now 7 years since, the first real short seller got a hold of information from a cybersecurity firm and said, hey, we'll bet against this stock. This is likewise not new. What's changing is courts are willing to have those short seller reports come in based on experts who may not be that expert, but have a glimpse into your organization. And you go, hey, they're saying things about us that we wouldn't like to say ourselves. Well, guess what? They beat you to the mic. And you're now going to be in a courthouse having to talk about it. And maybe you don't want to be second. And I think that's the nuance, Stephen, Luke's question earlier on, right? It's if you decide to hold it back, forget whether you're judged to be dishonest. If you decide not to talk about something and somebody gets to the mic in a courthouse, you're on the defensive, or you're always going to be in that place of, well, why didn't you share it? And I think maybe some of you, this is, something that I observe from the outside in, as I look at CISO conferences and events, and the public looks at them and investors, you talk very openly about tech and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And, every day there's a new email from the government about here's a new vulnerability. Everybody talks about it. But if you're going to be really, challenging in this, an investor's going to look over, hey, you have these massive conferences where you all try and hack each other and you try and get into this, that, and the other. You go to big cities and you play this game. And then when you talk to us publicly in your filings, you have about this much text that's, boilerplate.
Isn't that
that's general, and yet you want our money. And I think that, to make it real, that is the investor perspective of, if I walked into your conference, I'd probably learn more around the bar and networking about the truth of your cybersecurity program than perhaps you want to do. And so why are you
probably learn more about the truth of somebody's cybersecurity program by looking at the stickers that they put on their laptop?
That's a good point. I never thought of that as an OSINT technique, Steve, but it is, isn't it?
It's a big mismatch.
It is. I put stickers there because I like the stickers, mate. I have no idea about this company. Sorry I'll cover the logo up, but I put this here because I just love the fact that it says "Don't get cocky," right? I don't use their product, but I love that sticker. So anyway, and read the small print.
I'm conscious.
Right. So just saying,
I'm
but Paul's point on that, just to cap it, we are on the queue. But how many CFOs go out there and talk at conferences? How many CEOs are you seeing out there holding the mic on a podium? Why do CISOs do it? How many CIOs do it? Not many, right? CISOs are like, do you know why? I'll tell you why. Because they're at a stage in their career where they have to promote themselves. They have to do that because they want to raise people's awareness of this position and how important it is. And they think that the best way to do that, and they're not wrong, is to get out there and talk. Just be careful.
I think the field CISOs who work for tech companies, I mean, their sales enablement through and through.
They have to.
It's a completely different distinction in the role, I think. Last bit, and I promised I was going to do an impression of you, and this is going to be the worst American accent you've ever said, but I've ever heard. I've heard you say this twice in talks that you've very kindly given for the InfoSec Live community, and you say dollar bills, y'all. And the reason it was terrible, wasn't it? And the reason I'm saying that is it about following the money here for the SEC? Is there a bit of that about it as well?
It's also about I would say yes, right? Follow the money for see who stands to profit or gain. We always say that in crime. Follow the money because whoever stands to make the profit from it That's the problem. That's where you need to go for the source. But Paul?
I think, of course, there is, right? It's a civil action at some point. Somebody may end up writing a check here as well as some of the other issues, but I think it's bigger than that, right? To be sober about it. The personal liability here, and I think that's what's shocking some people. And I think you got to look at the macro sense, right? The government also lives in an economic moment, right? And the government is sometimes, certainly the US government, is in deficit. And, for every penny that gets lost somewhere, someone's got to bring it back. And, the SEC and others have for a long time, their approach has been, and the DOJ will get large corporates to take accountability by writing a check. But there is enough pressure out there of the public doesn't want that. It wants to see individual accountability and executives locked up. I mean, look at the, conviction overnight with Mr. Bankman-Fried, right? People want to see people get it badly wrong, go to jail. And I think this is that first warning sign now of, hey, talk about. I do want to make one last point, Simon, because I know you want to wrap, and I think I want to give Luke some credit here. I think part of the challenge here is, and Steve, you I think pointed me here, how do CISOs perform that noble exercise of informing the world about how to be better at security, but do it in all the right places, right? And I don't mean, hey, go write it in the 10K. I'm not saying write it in your annual report, although often it's in the annual report, right? Here's how we're investing in cybersecurity. Go talk to investors. Go talk to victim groups. Go get out there in your communities as you do, not just your own community, but like CISO community, but your own community. Go meet victims of cybercrime, human trafficking, you do it. And I mean, maybe that's the place, Steve, where I think CISOs will get fair credit for talking openly about the realities of, let's not even use the word security, right? Vulnerability. And let's get people more informed about that. And then as regular Jane and Joe investors, they'll turn around and go, I know why this company's not telling me about it, but I went to one of their meetings and they told me what they do and why it's important, what they share and they don't. I think that maturing of where to talk and how to talk and who does the talking, I think is going to be part of the sort of figure it out next.
Yeah. And I think, again, I know you want to wrap, Simon, just to...
No, sorry, I've got one more question I want to ask you, and there's a question from the audience that I wanted to get.
Yeah, I was about to say,
cards on table. I've got 5 minutes until I've got to jump on another call.
I'm just going to jump on Phil. I don't believe it's about making an example. And I think that's language that the CISO community itself is reacting to. Their spider senses are going up and they're just out there to make an example of this guy or this piece, right? And Boeing's been mentioned here. There's certain things I can and can't talk about. And what I would say is it's not about making an example. It's about making sure that people that accept accountability act accountable. And I think that's the difference there. And this is a big discussion, right? And I don't want to cap this. This is all you. This is a big discussion. This is a really big topic. I'm sure there are a million more questions out there that people aren't necessarily putting in the chat, but they want to ask. Paul and I are very, very happy from our two very, very different lenses and experiential viewpoints to do a follow-up where we could potentially do this maybe as like a fireside chat where we actually don't talk and we just sit here and we will just do nothing but take Q&A from the audience. If that is something that would appeal to the audience that we've got on the
I think it would. And are you both happy for me to share your LinkedIn profiles on here now?
Absolutely,
so
yes.
I'm glad you said that because I'd already clicked send on one.
two seconds. Yeah, I love that. Always better to ask for forgiveness. I think is that how it goes.
Okay.
Simon?
Can I just? Sorry, Paul. Go on.
No, Steve. I'm going to not diverge, but I think I'm going to take your point a little bit further on the question of is it about making an example. You can only make an example through individuals when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I don't think the SEC is trying to make an example of a person. And I think anybody who is reacting it that way, I think they're missing actually what regulators try to do. They're trying to make an example of the behaviors that are expected and the behaviors that are not expected. And I think it's hard to see that when there's someone's name on the top of it. And believe me, I'm not ignoring the obvious. I've dealt with regulators long enough, and if you don't deal with your regulator, then now is the time to be thinking about why you don't talk to them. Go learn about what they're about. They're not trying to shut down the market. They're not trying to police cybersecurity. There are good regulators and not so good regulators, just like all of our professions. They are like referees of a sports game, as they sometimes position themselves. They want the game to run. They want the game to be exciting, and they want the market to flourish. But at the same time, they can't have someone blowing it up because they think they can play their own game. And I think I'd invite people to sort of, when they go out there and read stuff about this, try and take the person's name off it, but it's real for those individuals, truly real. And we should all sort of, be on the benches about that. But look at the behaviors that they're trying to call out and the decisions and the things that people were not attuned to. I think that's where I think there's an example trying to be made. So.
No, I completely agree. We've got so many questions coming in here. Melissa's asked a question on your thoughts on how auditors may be affected by this as well.
Paul has a really, really fantastic view on that. Let's save that for the follow-up, if you don't mind, Melissa, because let's
take that for the follow-up. But again, Melissa, I have dropped Paul's LinkedIn in the chat, so if you want to connect with him and ask a one-on-one quick question,
then you'll get spoilers.
And you might get a spoiler. I think I had a question here I wanted to bring up before we wrap up. Let me just see where it is.
And I think Emmanuel's question that he's just asked as well, that's a fact. I'd really love to have a conversation about that because I think I have a very different view on that. Yeah, Carlos, exactly, mate.
Yeah, let's leave all. I'm going to do a spoiler here, and I'm going to say no more questions. We're not going to answer any more. 2 reasons. We need a teaser for the next one when we come back in a week's time and do this again.
Always keep the audience.
I've got a meeting that starts in 4 minutes, and I'm dying for a coffee beforehand. So Paul and Steve, thank you so much. I know it's decaf, right? Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your experience with us today. I nearly said expertise then. All of those who've jumped in the chat, a massive thank you for making this so interactive and engaging. We're going to be back. I'll speak to Steve and Paul after my last couple of calls today, arrange a date for next week. So keep your eye out on YouTube and LinkedIn for the next one. Any wise words from Mr. Hindle and Mr. Dunlop before Simon's quiet and presses play on the end video?
I'll be over at Steve's for a cup of tea and a hug in a while. See you later, buddy.
No, I'm jealous. Thanks, guys. Have an amazing rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, Simon.
See you soon.
Thanks, all.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.